There is a voicemail on my phone that I have never once deleted and never once let play past the first 4 seconds. Because the first 4 seconds are just him clearing his throat before he says my name, and that's the only part of it I've ever needed. I don't know why I called his old number that day, 11 months after the funeral, some Tuesday with nothing wrong in it at all. I think I just wanted to hear if it still rang through. It didn't. It went straight to a voicemail box that somehow, through some accident of the phone company or some quiet mercy of the universe, nobody had ever closed. I have listened to those 4 seconds more times than I could count for you honestly. And in 15 years of knowing Daniel Farrow, he never once told me he loved me in those 4 seconds or in any of the thousands of ordinary sentences that came before them. He never had to. That was never how we spoke to each other, and I've come to understand, only very recently, that it might have been the most eloquent thing about him. My name is Corinne Adler. I'm 46 years old. I live outside Providence, Rhode Island, and for the last 18 years I've worked as an editor, currently a managing editor at a mid-sized publishing house that puts out serious literary fiction and the occasional surprise bestseller that keeps the lights on. I should tell you how this began. Because the order matters, I've told pieces of this story to exactly no one in 15 years, not because it was a secret worth keeping so much as because I never trusted myself to tell it without either making it smaller than it was or larger than it was, and I'd rather tell it slowly, in order, and let you decide what size it actually turned out to be. I came to the house, Holloway and Prince it was called then, before the merger folded it into something bigger and blander, in 2009, 29 years old. 5 years into a publishing career that had so far consisted mostly of other people's slush piles and other people's credit. I was hired as an assistant editor under a man named Daniel Farrow, who was 44 at the time, married 11 years to a woman named Vivian, with 2 children still young enough to need picking up from school. Daniel ran the literary fiction list, had run it for a decade, had a reputation in the industry for being the kind of editor writers actually wanted to work with, patient, exacting, allergic to trends. The sort of person who could tell you exactly what was wrong with your 4th chapter and somehow make you grateful for it instead of ashamed. I want to describe him the way I actually experienced him at 29, not the way memory has since polished him into something more significant than he perhaps was in any given ordinary moment. He was tall in an unassuming way, the kind of tall that apologizes for itself in doorways. He wore reading glasses pushed up into gray-flecked hair and forgot they were there constantly, patted his own head looking for them while they sat in plain sight. He had a habit, when he was reading something he thought was actually good, of going completely still, not a dramatic stillness, just an absence of the small fidgets he did the rest of the time. So that within a few months of working for him, every assistant on that floor had learned to watch for the moment Daniel Farrow stopped moving. Because it meant the manuscript on his desk had just become someone's whole career. The specific ritual, the one this story turns on, started in my 2nd month and lasted, in one form or another, for 11 years. Daniel edited every manuscript in pencil, longhand, in the margins, and once a week, Wednesdays, always Wednesdays, never any other day if he could help it, he'd have me sit across from him at the round table in his office, not his desk, the round table by the window, and we'd go through his week's marks together, page by page, so that I could learn not just what he'd changed, but why. He called it walking the manuscript. He'd pour 2 cups of coffee from a thermos his assistant before me had apparently never rated highly enough to be trusted with. And somewhere in my 3rd month I noticed, the way you notice something only once it's already been true a while, that he'd started pouring mine with milk, no sugar, before I'd ever once told him that was how I took it. There was a distance between us, and I want to state it here, at the start, as plainly as the story requires, because everything else depends on your understanding that neither of us ever pretended the distance wasn't there. He was my direct supervisor, 15 years older than I was, married to a woman I met within my first month at the company, and liked genuinely, immediately, without complication. None of that was a secret revealed to me later. It was the fixed shape of the room from the very first Wednesday, and both of us, I've come to believe, understood exactly where its walls were, even when we were standing close enough to have touched them. But there were things planted early that I wouldn't understand the weight of for a long time. A blue editing pencil he used only on manuscripts he thought had real promise. I learned to watch for that pencil the way the rest of the office watched for his stillness. A phrase he said to me at least once a month in some form. The sentence knows what it wants to be before you do. Your job is just to stop getting in its way, which I filed for years under writing advice and only much later understood might have been the closest thing to a personal philosophy Daniel Farrow ever let himself say out loud in front of another person. And the second chair at that round table, the one across from his, which nobody else on staff ever used, though nobody ever told them not to. I didn't think any of this was unusual at the time. That's the part I think people find hardest to believe when I've tried to explain any piece of this to anyone since. That for years, all of it simply felt like the ordinary furniture of a job I loved. It was only much later, after the Wednesdays had already ended, that I went back through those years in my memory and understood how carefully, how deliberately he had built an entire small architecture of attention around me that never once asked for anything in return. The first time I understood something was happening that didn't have an easy name, it was the fall of 2010, and it was small enough that I almost left it out of this telling entirely. The way I've left out so many moments like it over the years, because none of them, taken alone, would prove anything to anyone. I'd ended things with a boyfriend that September. A decent, forgettable man named Peter, who worked in finance and wanted, not unreasonably, a partner who wanted the things he wanted, and I came in the following Wednesday having barely slept. Daniel didn't ask what was wrong. He never asked what was wrong. That was one of the unspoken rules of the thing between us, though neither of us had ever once said it aloud. He just poured the coffee, slid mine across, and instead of pulling out that week's marked pages, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a manuscript from years before I'd started at the house, something long since published, long since irrelevant to either of our jobs, and said, "This ending never sat right with me. Tell me what you'd have done differently." And we spent 2 hours on a book that had already been printed and bound and shelved, because he'd understood, without my saying a word, that I needed a couple of hours thinking about something that couldn't actually hurt me. I went home that night and sat in my car outside my apartment building longer than made any sense, trying to figure out why I felt so disproportionately, embarrassingly grateful for 2 hours spent talking about someone else's semicolons. I want to be honest about the limits of what I know, because I think I've earned the right to some uncertainty in the telling of my own story. I don't know whether Daniel felt, in that moment or in the 100 moments like it that followed across a decade, anything close to what I was starting to feel. I've turned it over from every conceivable angle over the years. There were Wednesdays where I'd have sworn something crossed his face when I said something that made him laugh, a kind of caught, arrested look, gone before I could be sure I hadn't invented it out of my own wanting. And there were Wednesdays where he was simply a tired man in his 40s, an hour from home, thinking about his own children's school schedules, and I was a 29-year-old assistant editor projecting an entire novel onto an ordinary professional kindness because it was easier than admitting how little else was going on in my life outside that office. I suspect both of those things were true, in different measures, on different days. And that's the part of this I've made my peace with slowest, that I will likely never know the actual proportions, and that peace in this particular case, has had to mean something closer to acceptance than resolution. What I can tell you honestly is what happened, because the events don't require me to know what was happening behind his eyes while they occurred. There was a manuscript in the winter of 2011, a debut novel by a writer named Ruth Okafor, difficult and brilliant and badly in need of structural surgery, that had both of us staying past 10 most nights for almost 3 weeks straight. On one of those nights, close to 11, I fell asleep sitting up in the second chair for maybe 15 minutes and woke to find his suit jacket draped over my shoulders and Daniel still across the table, still working, not looking at me at all. As though he hadn't just quietly given me the only warm thing in the room and then gone straight back to his pencil so that I wouldn't have to find a way to thank him for it. Marguerite Cole noticed something before I let myself notice it in full. Marguerite ran the rights department, had been at the house nearly as long as Daniel had, and had watched, I think, a great many things move through that office over 2 decades without being fooled by very much of it. She caught me in the break room one morning refilling my coffee and said, without much preamble at all, "You know he mentions your work to Vivian. She asked me at the holiday party if you were doing all right. Said Daniel seemed like he was worried about you lately." I remember the exact temperature that moved through me at that, somewhere uncomfortably between pleasure and dread. I said something about how thoughtful that was of him, and Marguerite looked at me a beat too long and said, "That isn't really what I asked you, Corinne." And I said I wasn't sure what she meant, and we both let it drop there, because we both understood there was nothing further either of us could say that wouldn't require one of us to say something true out loud, in a break room, on a Tuesday. I never told anyone the full shape of what I actually believed might be happening between us. Not fully. Not even Marguerite. Not even the one time my mother asked me, point blank, during a phone call, why I talked about my boss so often and with such particular care in how I phrased things. I told her he was simply a very good mentor, the best I'd ever had. That was true. It just wasn't the entire truth, and I knew it wasn't, even as the words were leaving my mouth. The small motifs kept accumulating in a way I only fully assembled much later, the way sediment does. You don't register a single layer settling. Only, eventually, the depth of the whole thing once you finally stop and measure it. The blue pencil, reserved only for manuscripts he believed in completely. A specific, rare thing he did with his voice when he read a sentence aloud that he loved. A small dropping of pitch, almost private, that I came to recognize before I understood I was cataloging it. And that line about sentences knowing what they wanted to be, which I heard him say to other junior editors over the years, in precisely the same measured tone, and which stopped feeling special to me for a stretch, until much later when I came to understand that the meaning of a sentence like that depends enormously on who is being told to trust their own instincts, and why. There was a publishing conference in the spring of 2012 in Chicago, 3 nights at a downtown hotel with a lobby bar that stayed open past midnight, and it was Daniel, myself, and a marketing director named Oswaldo Reyes, who'd been with the house almost as long as Daniel had. On the second night, Oswaldo went up early complaining of a headache, and Daniel and I stayed down in that bar until nearly 1, talking about nothing especially important. An author who'd left for a rival house, a manuscript that had fallen apart at the last minute, his older daughter's college applications, a full 2 years off, but already a low hum of worry in his voice whenever he mentioned it. At some point the conversation went quiet, in the way it sometimes did between us, comfortable rather than awkward, and I remember watching him turn his glass in slow half circles against the bar top and thinking, with a clarity that genuinely frightened me for a second, that if I said exactly the wrong right thing in that particular moment, something might actually, finally happen between us. I didn't say it. I've never been fully certain, looking back on that night from any distance, whether I stayed silent because I was afraid of what would happen if I spoke, or because some steadier, more clear-eyed part of me already understood that whatever did happen wouldn't be worth what it would cost either of us the next morning. He paid the tab before I could reach for my card, said goodnight in his usual unhurried way, and took the stairs instead of the elevator, which I noticed distinctly, because our rooms were on the same floor, and the elevator would plainly have been faster. I rode up alone and stood in the elevator a long moment after it had already opened on my floor, not quite ready to step out into the hallway and whatever ordinary version of the night was waiting for me there. Oswaldo noticed something across those 3 days, though I don't believe he ever said so to me outright. He mentioned once, on the flight home, apropos of nothing at all, that Daniel wasn't usually a man who stayed downstairs that late with anyone, that he'd always known him to turn in early at these things, going back the better part of a decade. I said, maybe conference schedules simply threw people's routines off. Oswaldo said, maybe, in a tone that made it fairly clear he didn't believe that was the whole of it, and then went back to the crossword folded open on his tray table, and neither of us ever raised it again. Back at the office that year, the accumulation continued in smaller, quieter ways. Daniel started leaving things on my desk without comment, not manuscripts, but odd, specific things he thought I'd find interesting. A profile of a woman who repaired antique clocks, a short piece about a lighthouse being decommissioned on the Maine coast, clipped from an actual physical newspaper, no note attached, so that I only ever knew they were from him, because no one else in that building still read print. I kept every one of them for a long while, in a folder I told myself was simply reference material, until the folder grew thick enough that I finally had to admit to myself what it actually was. There was a holiday party that same year where Vivian was present, warm and easy with everyone as always, and at one point, crossing the room toward the bar, I passed close enough to overhead Daniel telling a colleague's husband a story about the apartment he and Vivian had shared before they were married, a story I'd never once heard, told with real, unguarded warmth in his voice, and I felt something complicated and not entirely admirable rise in me. Not quite jealousy, more a kind of vertigo at being reminded, in the middle of an ordinary party with ordinary appetizers, of the whole enormous life he had that existed entirely apart from Wednesdays and blue pencils and a chair no one else used. I left that party early that night. He caught my eye on my way to the coat check, and there was something in his expression I couldn't quite read. And I drove home telling myself it had been the sensible thing to do, leaving before I'd had one glass of wine too many, and said something I wouldn't be able to take back come Monday. By the following year, 2013, I had started, privately and against my own better judgment, building a second version of my own life in my head, one where the 15 years and the wedding ring and the entire fixed geometry of the situation simply didn't exist, and I want to say clearly, for the record, that I am not proud of the hours I gave over to that particular exercise. I never once said anything to him that could reasonably have been mistaken for an invitation. I need that understood plainly, but I thought about it. Built it floor by floor on nights when I ought to have been thinking about almost anything else, and then I'd come in Wednesday morning and sit in the second chair and drink coffee made exactly the way I liked it, and fold the whole imagined structure quietly away, because I already knew, even then, precisely what stood permanently in the way of any of it ever becoming real. I said I would tell you the obstacle without dressing it up as a villain, because it wasn't one, and I think that's actually the harder version of this story to tell you honestly. It would be so much easier, in some ways, if there had been someone in it to be angry at. There wasn't. There was only a marriage that had already survived 19 years, by the time I arrived in that office. 2 children who needed picking up from soccer practice and orthodontist appointments, and a man who had built his entire adult identity around being someone who did not break things he had promised to keep whole. Vivian Farrow was, by every account I ever gathered over more than a decade of knowing her at some remove, a warm, capable, quietly funny woman. She'd trained as an occupational therapist, worked part-time by the time I knew her, mostly so she could be home when the kids got out of school. And she and Daniel had a modest house 40 minutes outside the city, with a garden she was, by his own frequent and fond account, absurdly serious about. I met her perhaps 6 or 7 times across those years, company holiday parties, once at a summer barbecue Daniel hosted for the literary team. Once when she came by the office to bring him lunch on a day he'd forgotten his own. And every single time she was warm to me in a specific, unguarded way I came, eventually, to find almost unbearable, because it was so plainly the warmth of a woman who had absolutely no reason to think of me as anything other than one of her husband's junior colleagues. I don't believe she was wrong to see me that way. I think that was, in fact, the entire quiet point of how carefully Daniel had constructed the thing between us, so that there would never be a single fact available to her that she'd have been wrong about. He talked about her more, not less, than you might expect if you're imagining this as some unhappy marriage he was slowly working up the nerve to leave. He wasn't working up to leaving anything. He'd mentioned some minor disagreement they'd had about the garden fence, or a trip they were saving for, or her father's declining health, in exactly the same easy, unguarded tone he used for everything else, and I understood, even in my most privately hopeful moments, that I was never being told these things to make me feel like his confidante instead of his wife. I think, now, I was being told them because he wanted to make certain I always had the facts laid plainly in front of me. He never once let me forget the actual shape of his life, even while he was quietly building this second, careful structure right alongside it. There was one night, in the late autumn of 2014, where the distance between those two facts, the marriage that was entirely real, and whatever this other thing was, collapsed down to almost nothing at all. And I want to describe it to you exactly as it happened, without inflating it into more than it was. Because inflating it is precisely the kind of thing I promised myself, at the start of telling you all this, that I wouldn't do. We'd finished a difficult round of structural notes close to 10 at night, later than either of us usually stayed, and he walked me down to the street after, which wasn't something he typically did. It had started raining hard and suddenly, the kind of cold October rain that comes on without warning, and we ended up standing together under the narrow awning of a shuttered bakery 2 doors down from the building, waiting it out, closer together than the round table ever put us, close enough that I noticed, for the first time in 5 years of knowing him, a small scar above his left eyebrow I'd never once had reason to see up close before. Neither of us said anything for a while. Then he said, watching the rain instead of looking at me, Vivian and I used to stand under an awning almost exactly like this one, before we were married, back when neither of us had a car that ran reliably, and I understood, immediately and completely, exactly what he was doing. He wasn't telling me a story about rain. He was drawing, very gently, in the only language available to him, the precise outer boundary of what this could ever become, at the one moment when that boundary might otherwise have blurred past recognition. I said, "That's a good story," he said. "It's the only one I've got that fits this particular weather." And we stood there another few minutes without saying anything further. And when the rain finally let up, he said goodnight the way he always did. And I drove home with both hands too tight on the wheel, and in 15 years, I never once came closer to it than I did standing under that awning. I've asked myself many times since whether he did that on purpose, Whether invoking Vivian under that awning was a door being closed in that moment, or simply a door being acknowledged as having already been closed long before, which isn't quite the same thing. I believe now it was closer to the second. I don't think Daniel Farrow ever once, in all our years, seriously entertained the shape of a life that didn't include her. I think what he entertained instead, what I believe, now, we both entertained, in our very different and very careful ways, was a second, smaller room, built onto the side of both our actual lives. A room with exactly 2 chairs in it and a round table between them, where something that never earned a name could go on existing without ever once threatening the structure it was quietly attached to. I went home that night and did not build the other life in my head. I believe that was the first Wednesday in nearly 4 years that I didn't. Something about the awning had made the whole private exercise feel suddenly childish, or maybe simply unbearably sad, and instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and sketched out, in plain, unglamorous terms, a 5-year plan for my own actual career. The kind of ordinary, achievable ambition I'd been quietly neglecting in favor of an imagined life that was never going to be offered to me, and I kept that legal pad for years afterward in the same drawer as an old paperback he'd once given me. As a kind of private admission that I finally understood, in full, what Wednesdays were, and were never going to become. The following spring brought the one scene from that period I've never told anyone about in full, because it's the one that comes closest to proving something, and proving things was never really the point of any of this. Daniel's mother died in March of 2015, quickly and without much warning. And he came back to the office after 4 days away looking like a man who'd aged a decade in less than a week. It happened to be a Wednesday. He sat down at the round table out of pure habit, I think, more than any real intention to work, and when I asked, gently, if he wanted to skip it that week, he said no. Actually, he'd rather sit there than anywhere else in the building right then. We didn't discuss a single manuscript. We sat for nearly 2 hours while he talked, haltingly, about his mother. About a childhood I'd never once heard the details of before, and at some point, without either of us deciding it consciously, my hand had come to rest near his on the table, close enough that our fingers were nearly touching, neither of us quite closing the last half-inch. We stayed like that for a while. Neither of us moved to close the distance, and neither of us pulled away either, and eventually Vivian called his cell to check on him, and he answered it with his hand still there beside mine, and told her, in a voice gone soft in exactly the way it always did for her, that he was fine, he'd be home soon, and when he hung up, he finally, gently, moved his hand back to his own side of the table, and neither of us ever spoke of that half-inch again. That was, I believe, as close as the boundary between us ever came to actually being tested, and I think what I've come to understand, in the years since, is that both of us chose in that quiet moment not to close the distance, not out of fear, and not entirely out of duty either, but because some steadier part of each of us understood that closing it would have cost us something neither of us was willing to spend, and that leaving it open, permanently, unresolved, was itself a kind of decision we were both making, again and again, every single Wednesday that followed. The Wednesdays didn't end all at once. They thinned the way most long, quiet arrangements thin, not through any single dramatic rupture, but through an accumulation of ordinary circumstance that only looks, in hindsight, like it was building steadily toward an ending the whole time. In 2016, the house went through a round of restructuring after a private equity firm bought a controlling stake, and Daniel's list got folded into a larger imprint with a new editorial director above him, a capable, humorless man named Whitfield, who had never, in 3 years of running that floor, made a single junior editor so much as a cup of coffee. The round table stayed in Daniel's office, But the Wednesdays got harder to protect. Meetings got scheduled over them. Deadlines compressed the time we had. And slowly, without either of us ever formally deciding it, once a week became once every 2 weeks, then once a month. Then an occasional thing that happened only when a manuscript of mine crossed his desk, and he asked, almost formally now, if I wanted to walk it through after hours the way we used to. I always said yes. I want to be honest here and admit that I always said yes, every single time, for years. Long after saying yes had stopped being about the manuscripts at all. In 2018, I was offered a senior editor position at a different house, a smaller literary press based in Boston with more autonomy and a real path toward eventually running my own list. It was, by any reasonable measure, an excellent offer. The kind a serious 38-year-old editor wasn't supposed to hesitate over for sentimental reasons. I told Daniel on a Monday, in his office, deliberately not on a Wednesday, because some part of me didn't want to say it in the one room where the other version of this conversation might once have happened. He didn't try to talk me out of it. He asked good, specific, generous questions about the new house's list, the way he'd have asked any junior editor about a genuine step forward in their career. And then he did the thing he'd always done when a manuscript was finally, truly ready. He went still for a moment, entirely still, and said, "You should take it, Corinne. This one's ready. Go build the list you actually want." I have thought about that sentence more than almost any other thing he ever said to me in 11 years, because on its surface, it was entirely, reasonably about my career. And underneath that surface, I have never once been able to decide with certainty whether it was also something else, a kind of permission, maybe, or an instruction, or simply an ordinary, decent man being genuinely glad for someone he'd spent a decade shaping. I didn't ask him to clarify. That was never a thing we did with each other. I left that June. There was a modest gathering in the break room, a store-bought cake, a card that made its way around the floor. Daniel's contribution to the card was a single short line. The sentence knew what it wanted to be, which no one else on that floor would have understood the full weight of, and which I read alone in my car in the parking garage for a long while before I trusted myself to drive. For a long time after that, I told myself a very specific, very manageable story about what Daniel had actually been to me. And I want to describe that story honestly, because it's the version I carried for the better part of 5 years before it got complicated by everything I eventually learned. I told myself it had been an intense mentorship with an undercurrent, nothing more substantial than that whatever I'd felt had probably been mostly one-directional. The ordinary, faintly embarrassing infatuation of a young editor for an older man who'd been generous with her at a formative point in her career. And that Daniel, decent as he plainly was, had likely felt something adjacent to genuine fondness and nothing beyond it, and had simply been careful, the way a good man is careful, not to let a junior colleague's evident feelings become anyone's problem to manage. It was a manageable story. It let me be a little wry about my 30s without having to reckon with anything larger sitting underneath it. I dated seriously twice in the years that followed. Married briefly and amicably to a documentary producer named Hollis, a marriage that dissolved after 3 years over the ordinary, undramatic erosions of two people who'd simply wanted different shapes of life. And through all of it, Daniel Farrow existed in memory as a closed, fond, faintly bittersweet chapter that I believed, in good faith, I had correctly filed under things that had never really been about him at all. We exchanged emails occasionally at first, a congratulations when I acquired a book that did well, a brief note when his older daughter got into the college she wanted. Then, gradually, less, and then, for a few years, nothing at all. Not a falling out of any kind, just the ordinary silence of two people whose daily lives had genuinely, finally diverged. I heard, secondhand, through Marguerite, who I'd stayed loosely in touch with, that Daniel had retired from the imprint in 2022. That Whitfield had taken over the list entirely. That Vivian's health had begun to decline not long after his retirement began. I sent a card that Christmas. I didn't hear back, which didn't especially surprise me. I assumed, reasonably, that he was occupied with things considerably larger than correspondence with a former junior colleague from another decade of his life entirely. In April of this year, I got a call from a Providence number I didn't recognize, and a woman introduced herself as an attorney named Aptheker and told me that Daniel Farrow had died 3 weeks earlier, quietly, in his sleep, of a heart condition none of us on that floor had ever known he had, and that I was named in a provision of his estate, and would I be able to come in, at my convenience, for a reading. I want to tell you honestly what moved through me in that first moment, because it wasn't grief, not yet. Grief arrived later, in waves I hadn't remotely prepared for. What I felt first was something closer to vertigo, the specific sensation of a door I had spent more than a decade believing was closed and correctly, permanently filed, suddenly showing itself to still be very slightly open, and I had absolutely no idea, standing in my own kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, what might be waiting on the other side of it. Aptheker's office was on the second floor of a converted brownstone near the courthouse, and I sat in a narrow wooden chair across from a desk stacked with folders, and for a moment before she said anything at all, I had the strange, out-of-place thought that I should have worn something more formal, as though I were about to be evaluated rather than simply informed. "Miss Adler, thank you for coming in." She had a folder already open, a single document clipped inside it, and beside it, a slim, worn paperback I recognized before I could place why. "I'll be direct with you, because Mr. Farrow was very specific about how he wanted this handled. Most of the estate is exactly what you'd expect, the house to his wife, in full, the usual bequests to his children. But there's a separate provision set up as its own account, funded gradually over a number of years, and you're the sole beneficiary of it." I remember saying, "I'm sorry, funded how long?" "The account was opened in 2018, she said, checking the page, "the year you left the imprint, and funded on a rolling basis after that. Modest, irregular contributions, sometimes monthly, sometimes further apart. Right up until a few months before his death. There's a letter attached. He asked that you read it before I tell you the amount, if that's agreeable." She slid it across the desk. I recognized the handwriting before I recognized anything else about it. Small, slanted. The same hand that used to write "See Me," wed, in the corner of a manuscript's title page, and I had to set it down on my knee a moment before I could make myself read it. "Corinne, if Aptheker's doing this the way I asked, you're reading this before the number, which will tell you more than the number does anyway. I want to say the ordinary part plainly, so you don't spend time wondering about it later. This isn't payment for anything you gave me, and it isn't an apology for anything I didn't. I started this the year you left for Boston, because I meant what I said to you that Monday, and I wanted there to be something real standing behind the sentence, in case you ever needed it and were too proud to ask. I kept adding to it, because it never once occurred to me to stop. And I want you to know, it never cost me anything I minded losing. Go build the list you actually want. I mean it the same way I meant it then, D.F. I didn't cry in that office. I want that on the record. Because I think it matters. I sat very still and asked, in a voice steadier than I felt, what the amount actually was. And it wasn't a fortune, but it wasn't small either. "Enough," Aptheker said, checking a second page, "to cover close to 2 years of a modest editor's salary, almost precisely, as though it had been quietly budgeted against the exact risk of a person leaving something secure to build something of her own. "There's one more thing," she said, and reached for the paperback. He asked that this go with it. She set it down between us, and I understood immediately what it was. A first edition of the very first manuscript we'd ever walked together at that round table, the Ruth Okafor novel, worn soft at the spine from actual reading rather than display, and inside the front cover, in the same small slanted hand, a single sentence. The sentence knew what it wanted to be before either of us did. "There's no further note," Aptheker said. He said you'd know what it meant. I sat with that book in my hands a long moment, and I understood, with a kind of vertigo I still haven't entirely recovered from, that he had kept his own personal copy of the first book we'd ever really built together, for over a decade, through a divorce he never had and a marriage he never left, and had marked it. Quietly. For a moment he must have known he wouldn't be present to see. I thought of the awning in the rain, and Vivian's name spoken deliberately into that silence to close a door I'd never actually watched him lock from the inside. And I understood, sitting in that office, that I had spent 15 years certain I knew the outer edge of what Daniel Farrow's care for me looked like, and that the edge had in fact been considerably wider than I ever let myself believe. Not because he had crossed it, not once, in all that time, but because he had spent years quietly building something just behind it, for me, that never once asked to be seen or thanked. "Miss Adler," Aptheker said gently, after a while. "Are you all right?" "I think so," I said, and meant it, mostly. I just have to go back and reread a great many old pages. I didn't call Vivian right away. It took me nearly a month to work up to it. And when I finally did, I didn't know exactly what I was going to say until I heard her voice on the line. Tired in a way I hadn't heard before, but immediately, unmistakably warm in that same easy way she'd always been warm with me. She invited me to the house, the one with the garden she'd always been proud of, and it was smaller than I remembered, and better kept than I'd expected of a widow only months into her grief. She made tea without asking if I wanted it, and we sat at her kitchen table. And for a while we talked about ordinary things. The imprint, his retirement, how strange the quiet of the house had felt at first. Then I told her about the account, and the letter, and the book, and she listened without much surprise on her face, which I hadn't expected. "He told me." Near the end, she said, turning her cup slowly. "Not everything. Enough that there'd been someone at the office, years back, that he'd cared about in a way he wasn't proud of and wasn't ashamed of either. That's how he put it. Which struck me, because it was such a very Daniel thing to say, trying to have it both ways even then. She looked up at me. I didn't ask for a name. I don't think I wanted one. But I think some part of me had always known there'd have been a name it belonged to, if I'd asked. Something in my chest went very still. "I want to be clear with you," I said. "Nothing ever. He never once." "I know," she said gently before I could finish. "That's rather the point of what he told me, and I believed him, for whatever that's worth to you. Daniel wasn't a man who did things by accident, Corinne, if he'd wanted to cross a line. In 26 years, I never once saw him fail to get exactly what he set his mind to." She said it without any bitterness at all, almost with a dry, tired fondness, the way you'd describe a stubborn old habit in someone you'd loved a long time. Whatever this was, it was the shape he chose to give it. I imagine holding that shape cost him something, but it was his to carry, and he carried it. And I won't pretend there weren't nights I resented not knowing exactly what I was standing next to, but I never once felt I'd lost anything real to it. Does that make any sense to you? "Yes," I said, and found, to my own quiet surprise, that it genuinely did. Before I left, she asked if I wanted to see his study, and I said yes. And there, on a shelf above his old reading chair, was a small stack of manuscripts I recognized instantly. Every book I'd ever walked with him at that round table, kept together, out of alphabetical order, in the sequence we'd actually worked through them, as though the years themselves had been filed by hand. I drove home that night and didn't cry until I was through my own front door. And then I sat on my kitchen floor a long while with the Okafor novel in my lap, tracing his handwriting with one finger. Understanding finally that I had spent 15 years certain I knew exactly what Wednesdays were. Right up until the last one taught me I hadn't known the half of it. I used the money the way the letter told me to. I gave notice at my current house that spring and started my own small imprint that fall. 4 titles a year. My name on the door. Nothing large. Exactly the list I'd always actually wanted, rather than the one that had simply been available. I keep the Okafor novel on my own desk now, not shelved with the others, and I have never once reread past that inscription. Because that isn't what it's for. I think, in the end, that's what restraint actually buys you, if you carry it long enough. Not a story with a tidy shape, and not a love you ever get to keep in any ordinary sense, but something quieter and stranger than either of those things. Proof, arriving years late and entirely uninvited, that what you felt was never foolish, and that being careful with someone, for long enough, for the right reasons, can be its own complete way of loving them, even if neither of you ever once says so out loud. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.